number of people from the weapons side of Chinese S&T basically said, here are the technologies of the future that are going to be essential, both military but also for economic competitiveness. And they were semiconductors and biology and new materials and energy. And these are the areas where we really need to make sure we don't miss the next wave of technological revolution. What has always been important to China is the control of those technologies, and that was going to cause inevitable conflict with the rest of the world.
Adam Segal, the Ira Lipman Chair in Emerging Technology and National Security and Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at Council on Foreign Relations. He served as the Senior Advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy. His 2016 book, The Hacked World Order: How Nations Fight, Trade, Maneuver, and Manipulate in the Digital Age. That book describes the increasingly contentious geopolitics of cyberspace. Adam's written a couple of other books as well, Advantage: How American Innovation Can Overcome the Asian Challenge in 2011, and Digital Dragon: High-Tech Enterprises in China. There's no one else I could think of to talk about the geopolitics of cyberspace, the U.S.-China competition in this space, which is really how the whole global cyberspace is evolving than you. Can you lay out for us like the state of cyber power, cyber warfare, cyber espionage around the world?
The Russia-Ukraine war and the use of cyber in that conflict. It's our first real kind of geopolitical major combatant kind of use of cyber. The Chinese using cyber against private sector actors to steal intellectual property, which is still ongoing, but we have seen an important broadening of the targets. Critique of Chinese hackers in the 90s and early 2000s was that they were not all that good. They were kind of noisy. They would just bang on every door, and if they found the door that was open, they would just go in. But that's no longer the case. We're seeing much more sophisticated attacks on cloud service providers and other types of platforms, giving them larger access to technology. The U.S. government over the last 2 years has called out a group they're calling Volt Typhoon. Can the NSA and Cyber Command hack into Huawei? I'm sure they can, but is it slightly harder? Probably.
What are some of the key lessons that you've drawn out from?
Joint operations with cyber takes a lot of planning. It's not going to take the place of tanks and drones as we've seen, but it definitely is a complement.
Who are the major state actors in terms of both capabilities, intentions, actual execution, other than, of course, the US and China are the obvious ones?
So North Korea and Iran. These are two countries that have decided to invest in cyber capabilities as an asymmetric approach.
What are some of the key debates around the role of the private sector in cyber?
With Ukraine, most, if not all, of the companies involved provided a lot of that support pro bono, and that's not sustainable. Right.
Where do you think India's cyber strengths, cyber weaknesses lie?
India did a lot domestically about creating a cyber coordinator czar and the cyber command inside the military, but I think has been pretty uneven as it's moved forward.
Adam, what I wanted to do to start us off was, you've written 3 books that I think over the last 2 decades almost now, where I think the topics of which, the themes of which have not gotten any less relevant. So that's kudos to you for having picked, I think, topics that have not just gotten, I would say, more contentious, but more relevant as well over the years. And so what I wanted to start off was to ask you how your views on those themes, right? The hacked world order, American innovation in the context of rising competition from Asia, and high-tech enterprises from China, how your views on the macro level have evolved on those themes.
Yeah, thanks. To some extent, yes, I've been extremely lucky in the topics that I've chosen. The first book you mentioned, yeah. Yeah. The first book you mentioned, Digital Dragon, was my dissertation, so my PhD dissertation, and I started the research in the early 90s. So looking at the first wave of Chinese tech firms, most of which had spun off from Chinese research institutes or Chinese universities. And I remember, basically cold calling these Chinese firms to do interviews with them, and they would be like, so confused. Why are you coming? We don't really actually have any technology. We're basically, most of them were often selling IBM products or, were local representatives. But occasionally I would go to a company, a company at the time that was known as Legend, which became Lenovo. And then people are like, oh, you should go talk to this telecom communication down south, Huawei. So there were some kind of early signs there. But, the argument of that book really was China is a long way from, having true international global competitors on tech. Um, the second book was, was happening at a much different time in 2008, 2009. So, Thomas Friedman had come out with The World is Flat, and the National Academies came out with a report called The Gathering Storm, which is about the demise of U.S. innovative capabilities over a long period of time. And that book, I included India as well. So it's kind of my first experience coming to talk to entrepreneurs and people at the labs in India and universities. And I remember my first week of interviews in India, and so I don't remember who it was. Some gentleman looked at me and said, "Oh, you're a China expert trying to understand India," which I thought was a really good way of trying to understand what was going on. And in that book, also, I was I wouldn't say dismissive of Chinese capabilities, but I was thought there were still lots of difficulties in place about moving ideas from the lab into the marketplace. And yes, there's lots of investment, but many of the what I called the software, sort of the institutions and understandings, were not really in place yet for China and India. And then finally, the last book, as you mentioned, kind of grew out of that book, because that book had a page that said, oh, by the way, if China keeps stealing intellectual property from the United States, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
And so then I wrote that book. But I think, not surprisingly, the biggest change is just, the rise of China as a science and technology power. The first 2.5 books really are about China's potential. And you could see things kind of on the horizon happening, but even the Chinese themselves were doubtful that it was going to happen. And now we're in a totally different stage.
Yeah, yeah. And when I was writing my own book, which I call the Great Tech Game, I was writing in 2020, 21. By that time, it was clear that the US and China were the two main digital superpowers, right? Tech superpowers of the world. And I was trying to find whether there were any others on the horizon, right?
Mm.
That was the underlying, I think, back of my mind type question, right? That is this now a given that these are the two, or are there signs of others that might come and emerge, almost like out of the shadows? But as you said, right, that sometimes a country's tech powers seem to be on the horizon, and then it's not a very long time before suddenly they arrive.
Yeah.
And so it's obviously interesting that it's taken a couple of decades for China to clearly have established its credentials as a tech rival for the US, and that's not an easy position to achieve, right? Given the US's own historical dominance in that space, but very interesting. And I was reading an article, I forget where, by Ambassador Fick, and it that sort of quote almost stayed with me. He said something to the effect that, tech seemed to be an increasing part of the game.
Yeah, I mean, Ambassador Fick often in his speeches will say that essentially technology is now the determinant factor, right? That
Yeah,
we would, in the past, we would look at demographics or territory,
yeah,
and often in public speeches now, Ambassador Fick will say, technology is no longer downstream; it really is the dominant factor.
yeah.
Um,
Not the only one. And I think that's a clarification I also had to make when I wrote my book, right? It was called The Great Tech Games. A lot of people said, oh, tech is not the only determinant. And I said, yeah, actually, it's not the only determinant,
yeah,
especially of geopolitics and etc. Of course, other pieces, other elements like territory, land, others, the traditional ones like oil, energy, these will continue to remain relevant. But I think increasingly tech seems to be the dominant
yeah, and I would say that the theme that runs through all three of the books, and then was was definitely clear in the 90s in China, even then, was the desire to control technology, right? Um, Even though at the time China was extremely open to foreign investment and to
Yeah.
cooperating with other countries, even then the language always was, this is short term, right? We're going to allow these countries into the market short term, but our long term goal is to control these technologies because it's essential to our national security, our foreign policy, and everything else. So, I think if anything, while my views of Chinese innovation have definitely shifted over time, and the capabilities have shifted over time, I've never lost my sense that what is has always been important to China is the control of those technologies, and that was going to cause inevitable conflict with the rest of the world.
Can I ask you the origin of that belief for the Chinese? If you're saying that this dates back to the 90s,
Yeah,
right? Um, do you have a
it
sense of what the source of that
yeah
clarity?
it essentially dates back to the 1890s, right, or the 1860s, right? So during the Opium Wars and the conflicts with the colonial powers,
Yeah.
the Chinese realized that without technology and without you could not have modern warfare. And so in the 1880s, if I'm remembering my Chinese history correctly, there was what's called the self-strengthening movement, which essentially said we have to have technology, right? And we have to be able to control that technology. So it runs through nationalist Chinese thought from that period, and then the CCP adopts it. They have the very close relationship with the Soviets, but when the Soviets refused to transfer uh, the technology for atomic bomb, that becomes one of the great accomplishments, right, of Chinese S&T is what they call the two bombs, one missile. So basically, the hydrogen and atomic bomb, and then the intercontinental ballistic missiles. So there's a kind of that drive for autonomy there.
But of course, it extends beyond the defense piece, right? At some point in the 90s, in the 1990s, from what I understand, you're saying they were not thinking only about defense technology, which would apply, let's say, in a warfare scenario, but it seems like they realized that it was going to be core to their economic development, growth, leadership as well. Right? I think a lot of countries seem to think that yes, for my defense, I need technology and maybe self reliance in some ways on my defense tech piece. But to actually think that tech is the main driver of economic
Yeah,
growth and leadership is, and I'm speaking from the Indian context actually, is not as um, intuitive as one might think.
yeah. There was a series of policies. One of them was called the 863 plan because it came out in March of 1986, where a number of people from the weapons side of Chinese S&T basically said, here are the technologies of the future that are going to be essential for, as you said, both military but also for economic competitiveness. And they were, semiconductors and biology and new materials and energy and things like that. And these are the areas where we really need to make sure we don't miss the next wave of technological revolution. We missed the industrial revolution, and we missed most of the digital revolution, or we're going to, and we want to make sure we don't miss this next thing. So you had the 863 plan, you had another one in 1997. The Chinese were very influenced by like Alvin Toffler and Future Wave. And so a lot of the leadership had read that kind of things. Chinese leaders were visiting Silicon Valley in the 80s. So a lot of the research that I did in the 90s was about different localities of Beijing and Shanghai in the South and how they tried to create tech ecosystems.
Yeah.
And almost all of them had visited Silicon Valley, the policymakers there. And I don't know if you remember, if you ever read, Annalise Saxenian had a book. She was a professor at Berkeley. She wrote a book about comparing why Silicon Valley eventually passed Boston and Route 128. And
Yeah.
it had to do about personal connections and flows of people and things. And often I would give it as a gift, to people that I became friendly with, policymakers, and they always said, "Oh yeah, we've already read that."
Yeah, no, very interesting. I think it's almost eerily similar to the conclusion of my book, at least as it was pertaining to India, was that don't mix that next wave,
Yeah,
right? You can't continue to catch tails of waves. That doesn't lead you anywhere eventually. You've got to be early in some waves, even if it's a couple of them. No, very interesting. Let's move to the state of, I think uh, your core, I think, area of interest and passion, and I think something that you probably know better than most in the world, the state of cyber warfare, um, cyber power in the world, right? Of course, a key element of it is the U.S.-China battle over cyberspace, which, as you rightly predicted, will get more and more contentious. But can you lay out for us like the state of cyber power, cyber warfare, cyber espionage around the world
yeah,
today?
sure. I'll try to touch on I think some of the few big themes, and then we can
Yeah,
pick a couple of them. Well, the first most probably prominent one is the war, right? The Russia-Ukraine war and the use of cyber in that conflict. Now, there's been a lot of debate about how important it's been,
yeah,
and was it a dud, or did it not play as large a role as we thought it was going to be? But I think it's clearly been a significant part of the war, and the attacks keep kind of transforming over time. So it's our first real kind of geopolitical major combatant kind of use of cyber. So extremely important and interesting there. The rise of ransomware as a national security threat, I think, is extremely important. So non-state actors being able to do disruptive attacks, and causing national security threats. We saw that with Colonial Pipeline,
yeah,
and we see the disruption going on there. I would say the probably the third thing is the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship in cyber. So you know for the most of the last decade and a half, the argument or the conflict has been over industrial espionage, right? So the Chinese using cyber against private sector actors to steal intellectual property,
yeah,
which is still ongoing, but we have seen an important change or kind of a broadening of the targets. And this is the U.S. government over the last 2 years has called out a group they're calling Volt Typhoon,
yeah,
and that group seems to be pre-positioning in critical infrastructure, right? So
yeah,
thinking about a conflict. So that would be the probably the third thing. I think the fourth and the fifth, and I'll end with five. The fourth is probably the kind of stalemate at the international level about
yeah,
discussions about cyber. Like we really haven't made a lot of progress in the last 5 years. Part of that has to do with the kind of breakdown between the relations between U.S. and China and the U.S. Russia, and then fifth is what is AI going to do for cyber, and that I think is pretty speculative at the point, but we throughout cyber's history, there's been a debate about is offense always going to have
dominant.
the advantage, and is AI going to shift that one way or the other?
Yeah, yeah. No, great themes. We can delve into all five, but let's maybe pick a couple, right? So let's start with the U.S. China cyber battle, right? The expansion of it, the changing dynamics of it, of course, the capabilities, how they have um, shifted on both sides or evolved on both sides. What's your sense? I think you've termed it, others have termed it like a digital Cold War.
Yeah,
Is it as cold as people think, or is it hot? Is just that we're not
it
thinking? But
yeah.
tell us like more about that U.S.-China piece, how it's evolving.
I think it's heating up, in the sense of, um, so I think on the Chinese side, as I mentioned before, we've seen this industrial espionage is still happening. The nature of that has changed in the sense that the Chinese have become more sophisticated. The you know the kind of critique of Chinese hackers in the 90s and early 2000s was that they were not all that good. They were, kind of noisy. They would just bang on every door, and if they found the door that was open, they would just go in. But that's no longer the case. We're seeing much more sophisticated attacks on cloud service providers and other types of platforms, giving them larger access to technology. And we're seeing the rising use of 0 days, so vulnerabilities that have not been discovered before,
Yeah.
because of kind of increasing sophistication on that side.
Which are obviously also more expensive to.
More expensive to use. Usually the argument was you'd wanted to keep a 0 day for something really, really critical,
Yeah.
right? Because there's so many other ways to get in because people haven't patched, or there's other vulnerabilities, or you can just spearfish them. But 0 days you wanted to hold in reserve. But Chinese have been going through a lot more 0 days than we saw in particular. And that may be because they've changed things domestically. They have more access to what information security researchers in China are doing. So we see increasing sophistication of the hacks. There was a change domestically where they essentially reorganized the People's Liberation Army and created a distinct cyber force. And they seem to have shifted most of the espionage away from the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, which makes sense, right? The intelligence agency should be doing the espionage, and the PLA should be focusing on using cyber in a military conflict. So we saw those things. So I would say that, is a big trend. The U.S.-China kind of discussions about it we really haven't engaged the Chinese on these. We've issued warnings, right? And there's kind of calling out of Volt Typhoon. There was, a dialogue under Obama, right? The cyber agreement about espionage, which the Chinese didn't really pay attention to. But there were still kind of discussions, at the DOD and the Defense Department and other places. That pretty much ended in the Trump administration. They haven't restarted. So there's no kind of discussion now between the two sides. I know it's been reported that in high-level meetings, the U.S. has raised Volt Typhoon and said, this is not good.
Yeah.
But the Chinese response, at least publicly, is to claim that Volt Typhoon is in fact, a U.S. operation that's being manipulated to try and raise the budgets for Cyber Command and the NSA. So no conversations, rising capabilities on the Chinese side. And, I have to suspect that on the U.S. also a set of kind of rising capabilities, and the fact that the U.S. has conducted many more what are called defend forward operations. So kind of defensive operations on networks of countries that invite Cyber Command in and say, we think we have or the U.S. says you have somebody on your networks, and they invite the Cyber Command in, and they learn a great deal and some disruptions there. So I'm going to guess that there's some increase in U.S. capabilities as well. And then finally, probably just the spread of Chinese tech, right, has probably changed the world and how the two sides operate. General Nakasone, who was head of NSA and Cyber Command before he retired, essentially said the operating space is more difficult for us now. And so I have to think that it's both the rise of Chinese operators, but also just, it's not home field advantage anymore all the time.
Yeah.
That the fact that, there are other tech players out there, can the NSA and Cyber Command hack into Huawei? I'm sure they can, but is it, slightly harder? Probably.
Have the intentions changed? So the capabilities seem to have evolved on both sides,
Yeah.
and that's not surprising. Have the intentions changed?
So I don't think as much. The U.S. government has raised Volt Typhoon a lot about disruptive attacks and how it might be used in a Taiwan scenario, or let's say the situation in the South China Seas and the Philippines escalates further. Definitely worrying. But the Chinese have been writing about using cyber for those types of conflict for a long time. And there are, in my book, I talk about testimony that happened under General Alexander. So we're talking at least a decade, almost a decade and a half ago, where he's asked directly in Senate hearing about the Russians and Chinese positioning on U.S. critical infrastructure for this type of scenario, and then being asked, does the U.S. have these capabilities? And he basically saying in one word, yes, but we'll talk about the rest of it in a secure location. So from the beginning, I think people assumed that cyber would be used this way. I think what's changed is, as we said, the capabilities, but also the regional conflicts are much hotter, right? 10 years ago, a Taiwan scenario was a possibility, but we hadn't seen, 10 years of increased pressure from the Chinese. And certainly what we're seeing in the South China Sea and the Philippines now is of an order of magnitude different than what we saw before.
Yeah, so it is a good segue to the Russia-Ukraine element that you highlighted, of the five that you highlighted. Now, my book came out literally the week that attack first happened. And so one of the first questions I got from, I think it was maybe actually the first book interview I did,
Yeah.
was, oh, you think tech is going to, I had a whole chapter on the future of war and how tech will shape the future of war. And person asked me, but look at Russia, Ukraine, right? It's tanks.
Yeah.
You're saying, right? It's like back to World War II. So clearly you're wrong. And I said, no, no, wait and watch, right? It will. But let's move to the Russia-Ukraine piece. Now, it's obviously one of the main hot conflicts. The initial push was obviously a lot more land and army battle tanks driven. Now, as the battle has continued, there's obviously all this talk of how much cyber and even US tech assistance from private tech firms as well has come to the aid of Ukraine in making sure that their infrastructure and their networks remain up and running. What's your sense on what the lessons are from that, at least one hot conflict? As you said, it's a consequential one for our understanding of how tech and cyber will shape the future of war. What are some of the key lessons that you've drawn out from them?
Yeah,
To you?
I mean, the first one is it's hard, right?
Yeah.
You actually, joint operations with cyber takes a lot of planning. And it's not, the idea that you are going to just pick a target, hack into it, and then coordinate with the aerial or the ground force troops at the same time. It's just not that easy, right? You have to do all of these things constantly, iteratively, and takes a lot of effort and time. And I think, that's this, because the Russian invasion itself was in many ways not all that well thought out. That's why we didn't see it that much at the beginning. And, now we're seeing it more coordinated, but it's still hard, and it's not going to, take the place of tanks and drones as we've seen, but it definitely is a complement and a supplement. And I think, we're going to see other people learn that lesson and do it better. I think the other one is, as you mentioned, is private sector and defense, right? Now, it's the big question, I think, for a lot of U.S. policymakers is how applicable that lesson is to other scenarios, and Taiwan in particular. But, the U.S. government and the U.S. private sector has been in Ukraine a long time now, and has very close relations. And so when 2022 happened, defense really played a role because they've been practicing for so long, for 8 years already, So I think that is, one of the lessons that we really learned. I think for the other lessons are, maybe spillover won't be as bad as we thought it was going to be. Maybe escalation won't be as bad as we thought it was going to be in these spaces as well. That, cyber for the most,
cyber element in particular.
Cyber element. I mean, there was spillover right for the Viasat attack that did, take out German wind farms and things. But for the most part, we haven't seen, like a WannaCry or other incident where it spreads to the rest of the world and takes them down. And I would also say, it's been useful from a diplomacy perspective, in the sense of, for the U.S. at least, to say, oh, look, we can actually help you. This types of cyber attacks happen. We're pretty good at this helping out thing.
Yeah. And of course, then each context, like Taiwan, will be very different. I think the stakes for the private sector will also be much higher in case of a conflict in Taiwan, right? For example. So
Yeah, I mean, the Taiwan scenario, it's very hard to imagine operating the same way, right? It's just the pressure that the Chinese can put on the firms is just so much higher than the Russians can do.
Than the Russians can, right? But then the potential loss for the tech firms also will be much higher if the Taiwan conflict goes in an adverse manner. So I think the stakes will be higher, the pressures will be higher. And it almost seems to me that the preparation for diversification of the supply chains by the private sector and by the governments, right, around the world, including the US one, but others, is almost preparation also, right?
Yeah.
That kind of scenario today. Let's talk about national capabilities, right? I think while, as I was saying to you earlier as well, I think that while for certain countries, cyber as a domain, cyber as a space for conflict and geopolitical competition and espionage and other applications in a way has become very much top of mind. Um, that's not necessarily the case around the world, right? So can you give us a broad image or a picture of where different countries, who are the major players today, both in terms of state actors,
Yeah.
and then maybe we can get into some of the non-state actors, but who are the major state actors in terms of both capabilities, intentions, actual execution, other than, of course, the US and China are the obvious ones,
Yeah.
but talk to us and clear the
Yeah.
picture.
So
Talk of
I
Iran,
think
uh,
like you said, you have the big players. You have the Chinas and the Russias and the U.S. And then you have the people who, from a hacking perspective, punch much higher above their weight. So North Korea and Iran, although of course Iran has a very sophisticated, well-educated population, but these are two countries that have decided to invest in cyber capabilities as a asymmetric approach to their things. Then I would say you have a series of states that really made a political decision to use cyber as a diplomatic or foreign policy kind of tool. Estonia being, tiny country, but also the first victim of a major cyber attack in its conflict with Russia. But since then, both the domestic economy of Estonia being so wired, but Estonia as a diplomatic force around the discussions around cyber. The Dutch are extremely active in this space, both on kind of attribution as well in the norms. Singapore regionally has played a very important role in discussing cyberspace and also trying to help ASEAN countries address cybercrime.
capabilities as well, or just discussion?
Mostly discussion. I mean, it's such a small country. I mean, technologically very sophisticated, but I suspect it's, like the Singaporean military that, we don't really talk about it very much, but probably you don't want to poke it because, again, technologically sophisticated, but, we don't probably see it very much in action.
Yeah.
The Brits with, GCHQ, the Germans, the French are, hard to know what the French are doing because they probably don't talk to very many people about it. And then, a lot of countries that have potential but really haven't stepped up. So South Korea every once in a while seems to make a sense that it's going to do something internationally, but doesn't really. I mean, there's a lot of coordination between the two, between the U.S. and South Korea because of the alliance. Same thing with Japan. Very slow to getting up to speed, but some more progress under Abe. India, did a lot domestically about creating, a cyber coordinator czar and the cyber command inside the military, but I think has been pretty uneven as it's moved forward. And then countries that sometimes hack for other people. We see Vietnam occasionally pop up, Pakistan, of course, for some kind of hacktivist reasons.
Yeah. So I liked your. You've mentioned obviously some are stronger in hacking, some have a slightly maybe bigger scope, some are staying sort of behind the scenes for now. You had in an earlier video I've seen 4 key pillars of cyber power, and I like
Yeah,
that. So if you were to use those 4 pillars,
yeah.
narrative piece, the capabilities, the tech power, the private players, the military willing to use these capabilities. If you were to use those pillars, who are the strongest on each of those pillars?
Yeah, I think you could go through and put all those countries in different boxes. So, U.S. and China hit all four.
Which you should put
Yeah,
out as the CFR
yeah.
piece, madam. But
Yeah, U.S. and China hit all four, right? They have a political leadership in this space, tech capabilities, private sector, military is willing to use it, and a narrative about what you want in that space. Some place like Estonia, hits on at least 3 of the 4, but also kind of loses on the size.
yes,
Singapore probably, hits on 2 or 3 of the 4. Israel hits on at least 2 of the 4, if not 3 of the 4. It doesn't really have a narrative, but so I think only the U.S. and China hit all 4, and the other ones we can kind of move through there. Tech capability at a global scale is limited to a few. Militaries we probably could put 5 or 6 there. Political leadership probably 5 or 6 there.
which are the 5 or 6 on the military piece?
So Israel, the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians,
The Chinese,
the
American.
Chinese, US, yeah,
So the
the
usual.
Brits, yeah.
Yeah. And so, if you were to use those 4 pillars again, where does India stand? Like, what's your frank assessment of where do you think India's cyber strengths, cyber weaknesses lie?
So India is like hovering over all the boxes. it could fill out all 4 in a way, but it just doesn't truly inhabit, right? So, like I said, I think the leadership sometimes there's a lot of attention to it, and then it seems to kind of dissipate. There doesn't seem to have been a kind of consistent push throughout the thing. The narrative, I think India has tried to split the difference, as it often does in foreign policy, between kind of the Russian-Chinese narrative about cyberspace and sovereignty, and then the more like-minded liberal states.
Yeah.
But it kind of moves back and forth between those, and so is closer to the U.S. and the like-minded around, the norms around military conflict and international law. Sovereignty is one that China sometimes, is closer to China, but isn't China on those things. Tech platforms, clearly India has the capabilities, but hasn't really developed the global platforms yet that everyone else is using, and so the capabilities aren't, I don't think, there yet.
Like, for example, what kind of global platforms are you referring to?
Well, like we mentioned before, the fact that so much data is going through Huawei and Chinese cables and other things like that, and while India, is clearly a player in lots of types of software, I don't think that's provided.
Hardware infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. Correct.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And in terms of the private sector, from India's standpoint, is your sense that that's a player there or not really?
I might be out of date. You can tell me, because my sense is that, and this is only from participating in a number of dialogues with India and track 1.5s, right? So where there's some official people in the room and some non-officials.
Yeah.
On the U.S. side, there was always a strong tech presence, right? The U.S. companies were always there.
Yeah.
And I always got the sense that getting the Indian companies into the room was much, much harder. And I don't know if that has to do just, that the Indian company's attitude is like, we want to stay away from the government and government regulation as far as possible. Or there was just a general disdain for what the government knew about technology. But I just didn't get the sense that that was as a close a kind of relationship. And maybe that's changed since I was last there, which is, like I said, in one of those discussions probably about 5 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. No, my own sense on that, Adam, is again, I'm not. I wouldn't venture to say that, I'm the most up to date on that particular element either. But my sense is the private sector doesn't see this as a very strategically important domain for themselves,
Mm.
right? And as a result, are not necessarily so much on the table also, right? Though I think from a country standpoint, from a national standpoint, I think as is evident across the board now, as is evident in China, as is evident in at least the U.S. and China, that the private sector has to play a role in this. The capabilities that reside in the private sector, whether software or hardware
Yeah.
or otherwise, are just so much more superior to what reside in governments now that I think
Yeah.
it's like a no-brainer that it has to be pulled in, and you've got to see how you pull that.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
also,
we have to remember like the one of the first instances of public attribution of, Chinese hacking was from Google, right? When Google got hacked in 2011 or 12 or 13, whatever it was. And Google basically said, that's why we're pulling out of China, because we've been hacked by this sophisticated Chinese-based attacker. Also we just have this, that Microsoft has essentially become, a promoter of foreign policy ideas, treaties and norms and institutes and things like that before. So I think you're exactly right. We have at least a number of U.S. tech giants who see this as a strategic concern for them.
yeah. Whereas I think that kind of same sort of thinking is not necessarily there, I think, yet in the private sector
Mm.
in India, is my sense. What about non-state actors, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things that I wrote in my book, Adam, was when I was talking about, I call it the golden age of cyber espionage, right? And I think you've talked about this, like the number of devices, the amount of time being spent, all of that is leading to this golden age of cyber espionage, and there's data and information, and it's in the hands of everyone now. You can reach and track everyone. Right? Those stories are often told now, but we don't have to get into that. But the question is, the other piece that I spoke about as a result in my book was that there's the rise of absolutely new geopolitical actors,
Mm.
right? Microsoft and the likes, of course, we've already discussed and alluded to. But talk to me about who you see as the key non-geopolitical, non-state geopolitical actors in the cyberspace today. It could be units within armies,
Yeah.
but it could also be like proxy hacker groups. But lay out that landscape for us from your perspective.
Yeah. So we've talked about the companies. I think at the top of the program, I mentioned the ransomware gangs. And so here we really have a kind of convergence of both technological change with cryptocurrencies that made this type of a crime really viable, as well as organizational innovation, right? So the ransomware gangs are so specialized and are ransomware as a service, and different parts of the organizations do different things. You get disrupted, it's easy to reconfigure. You get bad publicity for hacking a hospital, you reconfigure under a new name. So I think that has been a remarkable kind of change
Are
there.
there like the equivalent of big tech firms in that ransomware segment?
There are equivalents of, yes, kind of groups that are the dominant players. And they are both kind of innovating on the institutional and the technological side. I'll plug my friend Max Meets has a book coming out about ransomware gangs
Okay.
as national security and economic security threats. So people should pre-order, and you could have them on the program. the hacktivists are certainly still out there. We've seen Ukraine mobilize them usefully to some extent. Yeah, I can't really think of any other non-state actors out there.
Amongst the proxy sort of
Yeah,
actors, are they big established ones now, or they keep sort of shifting around and moving around and renaming?
yeah. So I think with the ransomware gangs definitely shift around. The Chinese are relying more on some private sector actors. So there was a leak last year of some chats with a Chinese company that was providing hacking services to the local Ministry of Public Security, and talking about the types of things they could do. So that seems to be happening, but the market seems pretty stable there, from what I can tell. Not a lot of because the Chinese themselves aren't disrupting it, so they are going on there. But I don't see any kind of new groups. Other than ransomware gangs, kind of emerging there.
Yeah. Let's also talk about the international alliances, right? There's obviously the Five Eyes that most people talk about or know about. Are there other similar alliances? So the parallel I'm trying to draw here is, if you look at just the regular geopolitical world, lots of new alliances shaping up.
Yeah,
Right? You have the Quad, you have AUKUS, you have everyone sort of working out there. Sometimes smaller groupings, but newer groupings, right? Interest aligned groupings.
yeah.
Is a similar thing happening on the intelligence and cyber side beyond the Five Eyes?
So for the U.S. Has basically said that for all its, well, not for all, but for most of its mutual defense treaties, cyber is a part of it, right? So NATO came to a similar kind of agreement that cyber attacks could, lead to the invocation of Article 5.
Yeah.
The U.S. Japan relationship has said that cyber attack could lead to invocation of the treaty. U.S. and South Korea just issued a statement saying something similar. So I think there's a lot of that happening for the U.S. at least on the kind of bilateral side. All of those things that you just mentioned, AUKUS and the Quad, have a cyber component of them. There's a discussion on cyber relations there. I don't see anything that's cyber driven, right? I see more that it's increasingly it's driven by critical and emerging technologies, and cyber becomes part of that discussion. Or it's already an existing military alliance, and cyber is expanded. But I don't see countries coming together just driven by cyber.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is, I think, interesting. I mean, basically what I'm understanding from you is that it's just becoming another arm or working group of existing groupings, but it's not actually driving any new. And there was talk about expansion of Five Eyes and all of that.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of that was post Snowden trying to assuage some bad feelings,
Yeah,
and there are expanding intelligence things, but I don't think those things are really on the table right now.
long forgotten now.
Yeah, yeah,
Decade has gone past.
yeah.
um, what about the economic cyber espionage that you spoke about, right? And of course, the US has been very vocal about the Chinese doing it. And you were talking about how that's evolving now. It's becoming more sophisticated, not as um, basic as or evident as it used to be. Are there other actors that are now trying to copy that Chinese playbook of economic cyber espionage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we've really seen it that often. Now, again, you have to assume that there are lots of countries that conduct economic espionage, and they probably use a cyber component of it. But I don't think we've seen. I think probably if you go through some of the cybersecurity reports, you'll see targeting of other industrial actors by some of the players out there. The South Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Israelis, and others. But we haven't seen anyone really adopting the full-scale kind of model of doing that. But yes, I suspect that it happens, but it's just not at the scale.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's now delve into the private sector. I know we've been like hovering around the role of the private sector. I think compared to the last decade, now it's clear. I think the headline to me is clear that the private sector has a much, much bigger role, much more accepted role, it seems, um, in cyber offense, defense, etc. Um, what are some of the key questions that today are being debated about the role of the private sector? I think you've talked about where do you draw the line? Are there certain pieces and functions that you don't let them into?
Yeah,
Is that the main question or main debate? Or is it that how do you ensure that you keep incentivizing them to do more and more
yeah,
alignment with government so that they don't go off the rails tomorrow?
yeah.
What are some of the key debates around the role of the private sector in cyber?
Yeah, I think it's those two actually. So the first one is on the incentives, right? So, and in particular, with Ukraine, uh, most, if not all, of the companies involved provided a lot of that support pro bono, right? They provided assistance to Ukraine for free, or at significant cost to themselves, and that's not sustainable, right? So we
Yeah,
have to figure out how does the U.S. government support that, or how do other governments support that long term? And there are now mechanisms that are trying to be put in place to do that. But I think that's one of the big issues is you can't expect companies to give stuff away
yeah,
long term.
yes,
And then I think the other is the role in these discussions, right? Now, the U.S. and other like-minded countries say that they embrace a multi-stakeholder model, right, to governance of internet issues
yeah,
and cyber issues, which means the involvement of the private sector and NGOs and civil societies, which is true. The U.S. government does support that, but there are still times when the U.S. government's like, we do not want the private sector there,
yeah,
and cybersecurity and those things is one of those spaces where the government's view is probably narrower of what the private sector thinks it should be there.
yeah,
Sometimes the U.S. government pushes more, right? So in the UN process, what's now called the Open-Ended Working Group on Information Security,
yeah.
the Russians and Chinese have been working very hard to keep the private sector and
Out,
the civil society out, and the U.S. has been pushing very hard to allow them back
get
into
them
those
in. Yeah,
discussions. But I when certain private companies start talking about digital treaties and digital Geneva conventions, the U.S. government doesn't really like that, right? Because the treaties and conventions are between states.
between states. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
That's right. I wrote about this in my book as well. Like there's certain sovereign functions that I think states don't want to give away,
mm,
right? Currency maybe being one of those. I think security being another. But of course, I think that the lines are very gray. They're never so black and white, right? I think security, a state might think wants to keep as its domain, but increasingly, it's clear that when it comes to tech-driven security, that so much of the capabilities now lie outside.
yeah,
But tell me, in terms of lessons, let me actually ask you two questions, right, as a follow-up to this. So one is that I think there must be examples of countries, and I think the US definitely comes to mind, but there might be others that you know of, where this balance, this cooperation and coordination between the private and the public have worked, right? So give me some examples of countries that you think it has worked beyond maybe just the US, one. And second, from those examples or case studies of when it has worked, it could be like incident driven or conflict driven, etc. But what are some of the lessons that one can sort of draw out uh, for for the future path of public-private cooperation on this? Right? What are some of those lessons, and what are the case studies that you could look at?
it's hard because so many of the domestic contexts differ, right, between the problems um, for procurement and how you cooperate with the private sector. I just know from my short time in the U.S. government, when we were talking with Australia about support for some digital projects in the Pacific Islands, which involved, both cloud suppliers, but also cybersecurity firms. And the Australians just had a lot more tools in place to be able to do that than the U.S. government did. And so they were able to move more quickly and kind of more efficiently than we were on that specific subject. So a lot of that is based on those things. Israel comes to mind just because of the so many of the Israeli cybersecurity companies came out of the military. And Unit A200, if anyone's spent any time on LinkedIn, if you're an Israeli VC, you have to put Unit A200 somewhere on there.
That's right. Today there are probably many people who are just putting that out there. It's like
Yes, I've spoken to many people who were actually in Unit A200 and are like, yeah, this guy was not there. Anyways. But yeah, so Israel is a clear situation where the military has played a role, and the connections between the two are very, very tight. GCHQ has tried something similar around ecosystems, trying to bring in the private sector in those spaces. I think it's in an early stage, so it's too early to say. China is another example that's really trying to get military-civil fusion close together there. Small countries have an advantage in this space in some ways.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows everybody, right?
Yeah.
Especially, in the tech sector. It was definitely true. You go to Estonia, and then after a day and a half, everyone has already referred you to the same 15 people you're supposed to talk to.
That's right. You're getting referred to the first person you met.
Exactly. Singapore is something, I think similar. And so I think that's a real advantage. So once a leadership decision is made that this is really important to us, it's easier to move forward.
And what are some of the tricks and tools you've seen work, right? Some has it been tax incentives? Has it been, I know you've spoken about information sharing sort of mandated by.
I mean, part of it has been, I think part of it has actually been some tax incentives, but a lot of it has been, having early successes. So then you create a pipeline that people want to recreate that success, right? So, and also early identification of talent, like the places that are going to, middle schools and saying, we're having a hacking competition, and oh, you won. Oh, and by the way, you're now going to this great new school for free for the next whatever years. Yeah. That really has, played a huge role. I mean, I think it was it Gates or Zuckerberg? Those the difference between the A team and the B team with coding is just humongous. Yeah. And so this is true in cyber as well, is that you really want to, people that identify the talent early, I think really have a huge leg up.
Yeah. Let's talk about now the international cyber policy document that you've spent the last year working on, and congratulations to you on getting that out. Tell us about it. Tell us the key evolutions in thinking that you think that year has led the U.S. government and the department, the bureau to, the implications thereof then for the rest of the world.
Yeah, so I mean, part of it is it's just there had been almost a decade since a complete international strategy had been publicly released under the Obama administration. So there's just a reflection of a lot of changes since then. But
if I'm correct, comes out every.
Basically this strategy came out of two things. So the National Cyber Strategy, which came out
in 23.
2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, has a fifth pillar, which is an international pillar, and it basically says, and the State Department is going to write an international strategy. So we came out of that, as well as a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that says the State Department has to write an international strategy. But the kind of the big ideas in the strategy in part reflect that huge amount of time, and one of them is that we're talking broader than just the cyber technologies that were in the earlier strategy. Like the terrain is much broader. We're looking at cyber and digital, but subsea cables, cloud,
Yeah, the infrastructure piece.
space satellites, all these other things. So that is just a dramatic change to what the department had to do before AI, all those things. So because of that, we need to take a full ecosystem digital stack approach, right? It's no longer enough just to say, oh, you've agreed, we've trained you in these norms about cyber responsibility. We have to think about your entire stack if we're going to help you on the cybersecurity side. And then finally, the kind of
Loves it, by the way, when governments start using the word stack. I think
yes, we're all everyone in government's very excited that they can use tech terms like stack.
that's why they jump
Now
up.
that now everybody can talk about model weights and AI too. So so the stack approach is a big thing. And then there's an idea in the strategy is the bumper sticker idea is what we were calling digital solidarity, right?
Yes.
And so that was an attempt to basically say to essentially position against sovereignty in a narrow sense of the control of data by authoritarian states.
Yeah.
But basically also to say, look, we're using digital solidarity to mean we're going to work together to align approaches to data governance and other digital issues. We're going to come to your assistance if you are harmed in a cyber attack, and we're going to help you build your capabilities. Right? We're going to be a partner of choice, and so that's what solidarity is really trying to get across. A lot of people have interpreted this as a digital alliance or a tech alliance, which it's not meant to be. I mean, there are certainly norms about behavior that some states will probably be outside of, but part of the reason why it has those three components is that it may be hard to cooperate on some things, but we think it'll be easier to cooperate on others with some countries. And the strategy was not trying to basically say you're with us or against us. It's more like, let's pick something to work together, and we think you'll see the advantages of all the other things we're talking about as well.
Yeah, give us some examples of where you've seen this work, right? I mean, one of the
Yeah.
models that it's
Yeah, the
worked,
best.
whether those will apply equally to, let's say, larger countries and larger
Yeah.
corporations.
So the best example is Costa Rica.
Okay.
So Costa Rica was a victim of a ransomware attack from the Conti ransomware gang. Many critical national services went down. They called a national emergency. And so the U.S. And the private sector provided $25 million in assistance, helped get Costa Rica back online, and is now involved in training, helping with the workforce and expertise inside of Costa Rican government networks. So that's the first one. The ambassador Fick likes to talk about three bounces of the ball. So that's the first bounce of the ball. The second bounce of the ball was that Costa Rica became a kind of more vocal proponent of some of the international norms that have been agreed upon in the UN in regional meetings in Latin America and Central America. So kind of stepping up as a leader on cyber. And then the third bounce of the ball is on supply chain. And as Costa Rica works on digital safety, digital infrastructure security, Intel and others are thinking about shifting some manufacturing to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
So that really is a whole range of positive externalities that came from this one thing. Sorry, just to answer the second part of your question, the Bureau very much wants to recreate this model other places. And when I was leaving, was looking for other countries that it thought it might be able to do this at. And so, there was kind of trying to decide how that next countries might be chosen, based on somewhat geopolitical, geostrategic concerns. Does this help us in the larger conflict? But also, what type of political infrastructure is in place? Are we going to have a partner? Those kind of things.
And this sounds like, I think, a great sort of holistic strategy, right? To boost many goals and reward the countries, both in terms of assistance, but then also economically through integration to supply chain. So it seems fairly well thought out. But at the same time, it still seems that there's a hub, there's the US, and then there are spokes where you'll help.
Mm,
Question, I think there's another piece where I've heard maybe the strategy or Master Fico you talk about that actually what you'd also like to do is build similar vibrant digital ecosystems in other parts of the world. And hence the question that I was asking, which was the second part of the question, is it that this could equally apply to others, other countries, larger countries, or do you think there's a model here that you could evolve where, let's say tomorrow, a UK does it for a certain part of the world,
yeah,
Japan does it for another part of the world, and so on and so forth, and where you're basically creating multiple such hubs and spokes as opposed to one, right?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Ambassador Fick has talked about that even though the Europeans probably don't believe us, that one of the things that the strategy he was trying to do is to say we actually think it's a good thing if there is European tech competitors, right?
yeah,
And that that both for kind of resilience and but also for governance reasons and everything else. So yes, I think there is a big part of the argument is that we want as many vibrant tech ecosystems in like-minded countries as possible
yeah,
because that makes us all better off. It makes us more innovative. It makes us more resilient and everything
brilliant.
else.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and yes, we can't do it alone, and we certainly can't do it ourselves. And so yes, the strategy talks about and hopes that other countries will pick up, and help in other areas that they're going to have greater connections to, expertise, ties to.
yeah. Which leads me to, let's say, another piece that I want to get to, which is the U.S. India cooperation, right?
Yeah.
In cyber, in particular. Of course, I think broadly tech has been a big, I would say, pillar for U.S. India cooperation over the last decade. Um, Critical and emerging technologies are part of that. There's ISET as a initiative. There's various initiatives to try and promote cooperation between the U.S. and India on tech related matters. But I want to focus specifically on cyber. Give us a little bit of a history from your perspective.
Hmm.
How has that cooperation evolved? Where does it stand? And challenges, opportunities going forward?
Yeah, so I think there was it started off with a fair amount of skepticism and probably a suspicion from the Indian side of U.S. cyber discussions and capabilities. There were some Snowden revelations that occurred about India, but not as dramatic as with
As some
Brazil
others.
and Germany, where they were more. But I think there was another case with the NSA domestically that's slipping my mind. I can't remember what it was. I think it was anyways, there's something that happened in the 2010s where there was somebody that was. Anyway, it's not important to get. But there was an incident that I don't remember. But then certainly under Modi, President Modi and President Obama signed an MOU on cyber. That was, I think, probably the first kind of high level. Yeah. So right now, I think there's most of the useful. I suspect the useful cooperation is on technology and workforce issues. So kind of cooperating on developing AI for cyber defense and some other kind of research issues. I suspect there's not a lot of cooperation on the kind of the operational side, just given the difficulties on the intelligence sharing and things like that. I think some cooperation on the norms and international side, but there's still, I think, some differences there. But I suspect mostly it's on the tech and workforce training, in particular, given that India has this amazing history of being able to ramp up and train IT workforces over a short period of time.
Yeah, and that would be to sort of also supply some of this cyber, let's say, trained professionals to the US, or you think this is largely for India's own domestic?
I think for India's own domestic, but also as a model for other countries, and one that we were talking about earlier, kind of U.S. and India could use in third cases and help
Yes,
there. Yeah,
makes sense. And
yeah,
a piece on this before we wrap up, and
yeah.
which is on the talent piece, right? One of the things that I've seen out of that strategy that you've also come out with now is real emphasis on talent, right? And Ambassador
Yeah.
Fick has also spoken about this, bringing private sector talent into the government in order to compensate for any gaps that might exist. What's your sense of how effective that kind of strategy would be for governments? Is that like a sustainable model, or is that as a short-term stopgap measure?
No, I think it's sustainable. It's really hard to get it in place. I think there's lots of demand. I know lots of technologists in California who would like to do it for a year or 2 years. There's interest in the U.S. government for it. There's some models of it where it's worked, but it's just really hard to get the bureaucratic pieces into play.
Yeah.
And so while I think uh, it could work slower than everybody expected.
Yeah. No, great. This has been fascinating, Adam, and wide ranging. I could go on. I think we could go on for a while, but in the interest of time, just two questions that I end with every podcast with. One you've already answered, which is a recommendation for
Oh
a
yes,
book that
I'll
people
push
should
Max's yes Max Meets book. Yeah.
and second is a guess. So you could use them for both, but ideally give us two different ones.
Oh. All right, so if you're not going to have Max, you can have my colleague Kat Duffy, who is at CFR now, and she works on trust and safety issues. So she might be interesting on content moderation, and she wrote a piece on AI and democracy. So if you wanted to talk about that,
Yeah.
yeah, or you could try to get Ambassador Fick.
Yeah, and any books that, of course, you've already mentioned a couple
Yeah.
along the way, but any books that you feel are like the must reads for people who are interested, who are listening to this podcast, who are interested in these kinds of issues?
I'm afraid that a year in the government meant that I didn't read any books. So I'm now starting to read books again. But I'm about to read, which is, I guess, tangential to our discussion, Unit X, which is,
I've just read that.
yeah.
I've
So
just read.
that's on my list.
Yes, I've just read that actually just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I somehow found a copy of it in India
Yeah.
recently. I did pick it up. I think very interesting. Goes back to that talent question also of the
Yeah.
private sector, public sector also. I think very interesting book. No, great. Thank you so much, Adam. This has been a pleasure. It goes without saying, if travels bring you to India, which
Yeah.
I hope
Definitely let you know. Yeah.
very soon, I
Yeah.
hope they bring you.
Yeah. Let me know if you're in New York.
Yeah, I will, and hopefully don't come around Diwali this time. Or if you come, then keep some days off to celebrate Diwali.
Yeah.